the Bank of England, under the cover of Europe's refugee crisis, that has the likes of Hungary forgetting its own past of sending hundreds of thousands of refugees westwards, or the more recent 1 million or so of economic migrants, has taken the opportunity to announce its latest cunning plan in its war on cash. But firstly, exactly what is the war on cash? Simply, it is government's attempts via their central banks to make cash obsolete, for which they use propaganda such as defending against tax dodgers or terrorists. However, the real reason for the war on cash is to have absolute control over the population, i.e. by being able to track every transaction and levy a fee on transactions, and in times of financial or economic crisis be able to instantly steal the value of your bank deposits through negative interest rates so as to prevent bank runs, and have automatic bail-ins, which is what negative interest rates mean, i.e. to instantly lose 5, 10 or even 90% of all of your electronic money all at the click of a mouse. For this to happen, the banks need to make cash obsolete, because as long as there's a cash alternative as a means of exchange, then panicking depositors fearing government theft or bank collapses can withdraw their funds in cash, as the people did from Northern Rock branches in 2007 and have tried to do several times since, such as in Cyprus and most recently Greece, where cash definitely was king. Now, before you think it cannot possibly happen over here, well, the Bank of England's own chief economist recently released a statement that expands beyond the current stealth theft of purchasing power of earnings and savings that is as a consequence of debt and money printing inflation, masked by government and Bank of England economic propaganda, which has successfully conditioned Britain's wage slaves to accept as being necessary for the economy to function properly, i.e. 2% exponential official inflation is good, and thus allows governments to print debt and central banks to monetize that debt by means of terms such as quantitative easing, which is a fantasy world for electronic money printing to buy government bonds from commercial banks, that forces interest rates down and asset prices such as stocks and house prices up. As we are all well aware that the sport for the banking system, well, effectively a banking crime syndicate, Britain's banks have had every orifice stuffed with QE money for the past near 7 years so that the banks could generate artificial profits on the backs of rising bond prices as a consequence of interest rates being driven down towards zero, with the base rate remaining firmly stuck at just 0.5%, whilst the Bank of England has transferred over 1/3 of UK government bonds onto its balance sheet amongst other assets, which is causing inflation that has eroded the purchasing power of savings. However, I recognise what I termed as the quantum of quantitative easing a good 4 years ago, which is that of the effective stealth cancellation of UK government debt by virtue of a perpetual smoke and mirror cycle, one where the Bank of England prints money to buy government debt from the banks. Therefore, the government pays the Bank of England interest on this debt, most of which then gets recycled back to the UK Treasury. So in effect, the government has free money to spend that it should not have. And the more bonds the Bank of England buys, the less net interest the government has to pay. Imagine if one day all of the bonds were owned by the Bank of England. This will mean that the net interest paid by the government on all of its approximately 1.2 trillion of debt will be virtually zero. So effectively the government has no debt to service, because without any interest to pay, it effectively ceases to exist. the government is actually reducing its debt burden, as the debt is actually being cancelled, as the net debt interest burden falls towards zero.
Today we're going to the Bank of England.
As the debt to GDP graph illustrates, that Britain's actual debt burden is more around 40% rather than the official 80% that the academics continuously worry about. Furthermore, understand this: QE is permanent. The Bank of England's balance sheet will never be shrunk, but instead will periodically keep inflating during each future financial crisis.
Now we're inside the Bank of England.
Now, the Bank of England, in a speech by its chief economist Andrew Haldane, is proposing hyper QE, which requires the scrapping of all hard cash circulating in the economy that totals some 80 billion in the UK, and moving completely to a digital currency in what amounts to an ongoing global war on cash. The reason for this is that then the Bank of England would have the ability to force people to spend their hard-earned savings, because if they did not, then the Bank of England could set a negative interest rate, which is charging people interest on their money in the bank. That effectively amounts to deleting money from their bank accounts and digital wallets, all at the flick of a switch. Whilst today, if the Bank of England attempted a policy of negative interest rates on savings in the banks, and people faced with such a catastrophe that effectively amounts to the outright theft of their hard-earned savings, would then just withdraw all of their money out as cash. So the Bank of England's cunning plan is to scrap cash, and then it can be deleted X percentage of everyone's cash, all at the click of a mouse, thus forcing panicking savers to spend all of their hard-earned savings on mostly imported Chinese junk, as they would have no control over the Bank of England deleting X percent every so often. Think it can't happen? Well, this is the primary lesson that the central banks have learned from the financial crisis of 2008 and how to deal with it, for which they need to make cash obsolete, i.e. the banks charge 5% or even 10% so as to trigger panic consumption amongst bank depositors, thus halting the financial crisis in its tracks, which they could not do in 2008 because there would have been a run on the banks as people withdrew their deposits in cash, much as happened with Northern Rock the previous year. However, rather than scrapping cash altogether, the first true step on this route will probably be differing rates of exchange for paper money and electronic money. Using paper money will incur a cost, much as occurs when making most utility bill payments today. They incur a percentage cost for using a credit card rather than a debit card, the effect of which will be to slowly wean the general public off of using cash, as its value is literally stolen by a rising percentage until hardly anyone would use cash for anything other than minor small transactions. This is the Bank of England's and other central banks' cunning master plan for implementing zero interest rates to ensure stealth theft of purchasing power can always continue, even in times of disinflation or even outright deflation, or of course the next financial crisis when savers will have nowhere to run, thus eliminating bank runs, where instant bail-ins will transfer 5, 10 or as much as 50% of one's savings, Cyprus style, onto the banking crime syndicate's balance sheet, against all of which the world's wage slaves need to work hard towards protecting themselves against, where the most obvious protection lies in utilizing most of one's savings into buying assets that are leveraged to the debt and money printing inflation, and are of course immune to digital theft, such as properties and other assets that cannot be easily printed, i.e. one could put a few percentage into precious metals and coins, or understand this, that scrapping cash and implementing negative interest rates, i.e. bail-ins, would be highly inflationary, as people would spend and buy to inflate asset prices to prevent the banks from stealing ever-increasing amounts of their savings, which is what a completely digital currency will be all about.
And that was our day at the Bank of England.
And then there are the unforeseen consequences of government agencies that will be able to target groups of people or even individuals such as political activists or journalists or any critic who could literally be instantly become penniless without any ability to pay for even food, let alone regular household bills, that would soon put people on the path towards default and bankruptcy. It would be as easy as a mouse click to set in process the ability of governments to easily destroy the lives of any individual or group of people, that would amount to living in a financial totalitarian state that masquerades as a Western democracy. In fact, even without a financial crisis or the government targeting individuals for financial deletion, eliminating cash would allow the banking crime syndicate to, instead of paying interest on bank deposits, but instead levy an annual charge of, for instance, 1%, so that like vampires they suck the financial blood of their customers who would have nowhere else to escape to, as they would be locked into a financial blood-sucking system. However, as we have seen countless times in the past, is that there are unforeseen consequences, and one such of digital theft would be hyperinflation. As savers panic dump digital currency, as no one wants to hold on to a digital currency that's continuously depreciating, and thus start to hoard consumer goods for which they will continuously have less digital currency to purchase, that is constantly being deleted by negative interest rates. That is what hyperinflation of the future will look like. The bottom line is to protect against digital theft of savings by buying hard assets such as property, land, rare objects, and precious metals and coins.